The views and opinions expressed by our guests are their own and do not necessarily reflect those of the podcast or of its host, Rob Drake.
How we escaped.
Rob Drake here. You know I always want to get you to our guest as quickly as possible, but I need to take just a moment to share a few things about this episode before we dive in. First, this is a powerful episode, and I really hope you'll stay with us for it. But please know, going in, today's conversation covers physical violence, sexual assault, spiritual and emotional abuse, and suicidal ideation. It also contains strong language. Listener discretion is advised. And a quick personal note. My family was once involved with the group we're discussing today. So I'll be upfront, I am not an impartial observer here. And finally, we ran out of time before our guest could share one particularly compelling story about her experience with this group. I don't want you to miss it, so keep an eye out for a bonus mini episode of How We Escaped, dropping sometime in the next week. Now, let's get to it. Remember Cabbage Patch Kids? Those chubby-cheeked, yarn-haired little dolls that every kid just had to have back in the 1990s? Each one came with its very own name and its own birth certificate, and they were a big craze. And our guest today, like millions of other kids, well, she had her own little collection of Cabbage Patch Kids. That is, until one day, when the leader of the cult her family was in decided that these dolls were evil and needed to be destroyed.
And so we all had to go out there around this burn barrel in the driveway and say prayers of repentance to God as we lit our toys on fire. And I think there was a lot of crying on the part of the kids.
Amanda Briggs is the co-host of the Cult I Left Behind podcast. She was raised inside a group called the Institute in Basic Life Principles, or IBLP. If you don't know what that is, don't worry. You will find out in just a few minutes. But you may recognize the name if you are familiar with the Duggar family from the TV show 19 Kids and Counting.
Bill Gothard, who led the IBLP cult for many years, said that it was idolatry to have a Cabbage Patch doll because you had to sign an adoption certificate saying you would love the doll forever. That was idolatry. You couldn't love something in that way. You couldn't put your name on that certificate. So that allowed a satanic entryway into your house as well as your heart where Satan could build a stronghold.
And so naturally, the only thing to be done was to
burn them. We actually had to find a way to light them on fire. So in my family, that looked like a burn barrel in the driveway. One evening, I was a little kid. We threw in My Little Ponies for good measure because they were magic, and we can't have magic because that's also sin and Satan.
And so Amanda and her siblings stood in the driveway that night and watched as their favorite toys went up in flames. On today's episode of How We Escaped, Amanda takes us back into her childhood home and helps us understand what it was like growing up in a family whose parents took their marching orders from one man, a man who claimed to have all the answers for how to raise a functional, healthy, and successful family.
This is the How We Escaped podcast. And now, here's your host, Rob Drake.
Welcome, fellow sojourners, to the How We Escaped podcast. So how did you feel, Amanda, when you were told that your Cabbage Patch Kids and My Little Ponies were demonic and needed to be destroyed? Did you believe this at the time, or did part of your young self think this was baloney?
I don't know that I identified it as baloney. I was just so sad that I had to burn my toys because I played with them every single day. I have very distinct memories of family, like prayer time At night, we would do family devotions, and my bio dad would get out his guitar and he would play songs, and we'd sing and we'd read the Bible, or we'd read one of the other cult materials. And I would sit there with dolls or with My Little Ponies and the little comb, like brushing their mane and tail. And it was very soothing to me. And that was how I got through the long, boring family devotion times in the evenings. So for me, it was more like a sense of loss that these objects that brought me a lot of comfort literally went up in smoke. I think I believed the satanic and demonic thing at the time. I was very young. We're talking like probably the 5 to 7-year-old range. So I don't think I had the wherewithal at that time to fight back theologically. I was just heartbroken that my toys got burned.
Were your parents at all apologetic about this, or was it just matter of fact, Bill Gothard said we have to do this, and we're going to do it joyfully?
I think it was more the latter, that Bill Gothard said we were going to do this, so no ifs, ands, or buts, it's going to happen. And I think it was a lot less traumatic for my parents. I think to them it was a checklist item to do the right thing, to burn these toys, get them out of our home, remove that potential entry point for Satan. So for them, I'm sure there was like this sense of righteous urgency. And for me and my siblings, it was just grief. And I don't remember that grief being met with empathy or compassion or comfort. More just that like, okay, we got to do this next.
Well, we're going to get into your story now. And my first question for you is, when you were growing up and when people looked at your family from the outside, what did they see?
That's a good question. They saw a very large family that from the outside really had it together. So I'm the fourth of 8 children. So with my bio parents and my siblings, we're a family of 10. And I don't know if it was the 90s or IBLP, but matching was a really big thing. All of our names start with A, and then we would have to hand make a lot of our own clothes, at least for the females, because it had to meet certain standards of modesty. So we'd get the same pattern at Joann Fabrics, and then we get the same material, but maybe just slight color variations. So we looked very put together, and we walked around in a nice little row. Sometimes we did the thing where everyone had their hands on the shoulders of the kid ahead of them, like a train. We were capable of being well-behaved and polite in public. Rick and Chris, my bio parents, were very physically affectionate and demonstrative with each other. Everyone said they acted like newlyweds, no matter how long they'd been married. They were pretty kind to us, their children, in public. So I think we looked just very put together, polite, well-mannered, obedient, very obedient, and probably we looked like this lovely, wholesome family from the outside.
Before we hear about what your family experience was actually like, we need to talk about an organization called the Institute in Basic Life Principles, also known as IBLP. Sadly, this organization has been back in the news recently because of the arrest of Joseph Duggar. Joseph, who is a member of the famous Duggar clan from the TV show 19 Kids and Counting, has been accused of molesting a 9-year-old girl. And it's also worth noting that his wife, Kendra, was arrested for alleged child endangerment and false imprisonment. And our listeners probably remember Joseph's brother, Josh Duggar, who was convicted and imprisoned on charges of receiving child porn a few years back. And even before these charges came to light, it was already known that Josh had molested 4 of his sisters and a babysitter. And wow, that's some heavy stuff. The Duggar family served for many years as the poster family for this IBLP organization. And you'll be hearing more about IBLP on today's show. So Amanda, if you wouldn't mind, please clue us in about IBLP and what this organization was all about.
Yeah, I'm happy to. So IBLP was founded by Bill Gothard, actually all the way back in 1961. And it went through a lot of iterations in terms of what it was called and its mission. It initially started under the name Campus Teams. It's a very conservative, fundamentalist Christian organization. From what I recall, they didn't adhere to a specific denomination. It was what Bill said was from God. And the way it flowed was from God to Bill, from Bill to the fathers, from the fathers to the mothers, and then down to the children. So Bill, according to what he said and what everyone believed, had, that direct line to God. And he had the truth, he had the only truth. And so everyone who was following Bill was following God in the best way. And Bill had teachings for everything, from how to dress, how to speak, what to do with your life. I mean, it was intense, and some of it's laughable, like how to regulate your digestive system. He was really into that for some reason. Modesty, purity culture was part of the teachings. And he also is well known for his umbrella of authority teaching, which is, again, that very male-centric, hierarchical obedience line, basically, where the father of a family is the umbrella that protects his wife and children from Satan's fiery darts. That's what it was called. I did not make that up. Satan's fiery darts. And if the father was perfectly aligned with everything Bill Gothard taught, then his umbrella was intact. He was a good umbrella. And if that father got out of line in any way, then the umbrella wavered and Satan's fiery darts could hit him, his wife, his children. It could, create those opportunities for Satan to gain an entrance into the home and into your hearts and build those strongholds. He had teachings on, literally every topic of life.
I wanted to point out, as far as I know, Bill, who doled out so much advice for families, was never married himself.
You are correct. He never married. He thought that he needed to be like the Apostle Paul and focus only on ministry. He led 2 seminars that were the most well-known. There was the basic seminar that was the entry point into the cult. After you went through that, you could then go to the advanced seminar. There were seminars for fathers, seminars for mothers, seminars for teens, seminars for managing your finances. So it branched out. And then they also had an annual conference in Knoxville, Tennessee, where everyone could come. It was about a week long. You could buy all your homeschooling curriculum, because that was another thing that IBLP eventually developed, was a homeschooling program called the Advanced Training Institute, or ATI. And it wasn't real educational material. Let's be very clear about that. But they sold it, and you could go to the conference and get all of that material. You could get all of Bill's books. He constantly wrote and published in-house, book after book after book. So he would promote those at these conferences. It was a huge production. They rented out a university in Knoxville, and that's where they hosted it. And it would have programming for the boys, programming for the girls, programming for parents, all during the day. And then everyone would come together in the evenings for the huge session where everyone could participate. And that was also where Bill would, announce his new agendas, his new teachings. It kind of all, like, Knoxville was a huge, huge part of IBLP and ATI. And it was a big moneymaker for the cult as well. So if you bump into someone who grew up in IBLP, say Knoxville, and just see what happens to their face. We all remember it.
Well, that's a great overview, Amanda. And I just want to say that your podcast, The Coal I Left Behind, does a great job of covering IBLP over a number of episodes. So if you want to learn more, go into depth, please go and listen to their podcast. Amanda and Kyle do a really good job of giving us the history of the organization. And even if you were in IBLP and think that you know all about it, you might be surprised about some things that you learn, especially about the early history of this organization and some things that I learned about Bill and his family, which were quite shocking. So, Amanda, getting back to your family, and you mentioned the matching names. I mean, the Duggar family is also famous, I think, for their matching names. All of their kids had names starting with J, so that was definitely a thing in IBLP. But you just described to us how people saw your family. So let's get into what your family was actually like. What was going on behind the curtains or behind closed doors?
Absolute chaos. My biological mother was a terribly abusive woman. And let me do a quick topic warning for everyone to answer some of these questions honestly. I'm going to need to talk about physical violence, spiritual and emotional abuse, sexual assault. So all of those themes will come up as I share my story. I'm also going to speak to suicidal ideation. So please just be aware of that and know that I will handle these topics with care and sensitivity and compassion because I know I'm not the only person with these lived experiences. So my biological mother was really, really physically abusive. She would beat and whip us. The cult actually sold an implement that parents could use to beat their children. It's called a switch. It was a long rubber tool, and it came with a little pamphlet to teach you how to use it. The cult was very spare the rod, spoil the child, and followed the teachings of the Pearls. If you've heard of them, they had very harmful ideology around raising children and disciplining children. And Rick and Chris, my bio parents, adhered to that methodology. I think the last time I was hit in the face, I was 21 years old. And the physical violence from my biological mother only stopped when I married my ex-husband because under IBLP's teaching, when I got married, authority and ownership of me transferred from my father to my husband. So the physical violence was just a very normal and horrific part of growing up in that home. We looked so polite and well-mannered out in society. At home, verbal violence was also very common. There was a lot of screaming and yelling on the part of the parents.
And what about your father? What was he like?
He was not as physically violent, but he was really volatile in terms of his anger and aggression, and he usually found other things to take it out on. He did not usually take it out on humans. So he would throw things. He would go out to the garage and throw tools around when he was upset, but he didn't usually lift a hand against me. He spanked me, but he didn't do the more gruesome spankings. I consider this a pretty egregious form of assault, but Chris believed in, bare bottom spankings and things like that. So there was a lot of violence to how she approached punishment. She was not in control of her emotions. So, when she flew off the handle, she was gone. And I used to think she was demon possessed. And there was a period of my life where I slept with a wire hanger under my pillow because I was so afraid that she was going to kill me in one of her rages. And I had go bags packed for my younger siblings and a plan for how we could get to our grandparents' house, an hour and a half away. And I was very, very concerned about my younger siblings all the time. I have 4 of them, and my 3 younger brothers probably took the brunt of Chris's physical violence, and that was horrifying.
Was there any way for you to defend yourself from Chris, or were you just helpless?
I would take the switch and hide it. We had to wear really long skirts, so I would tuck it into my waistband and hide it down the side of my skirt and smuggle it out of the house and dispose of it. One time I put it in a drain like a quarter mile away from the house, but she would just order a new one.
You've already mentioned how protective you were of your siblings. What was your relationship like with them?
They were okay, and they were volatile. We were all traumatized. We did not have healthy relationships with each other, but there was typical sibling bickering. There was typical sibling arguments and ruptures. But generally, I would say, at least for me, I was very protective of my siblings. occasionally too protective of them, especially in the case of my older brother who sexually assaulted me throughout my childhood. So that was another thing that was going on in the privacy of our home that no one probably ever would have guessed from the outside. My older brother is incredibly charismatic. He's charming. Everyone loved him. He's, funny and smart, and everyone looked up to him, and he was well known and well established within the cult. He and my oldest sister, so the two oldest, worked at the cult headquarters in Oak Brook, Illinois for years. Very well known, very well established. I think it was shocking when I eventually reported him and that story came out. So I don't think anyone would have guessed the level of chaos and violence that reigned in our home when they just, met us out in the real world, or even at cult functions or the cult church we attended.
Your family, you all went to church. Your parents claimed to be Christians. They were raising a Christian family. They were part of IBLP. What in the world was going on here? How could this disparity exist? And why were your parents able to present this image when all of this stuff was going on at home? I mean, what's the reason for this?
That's a wonderful question, and I have grappled with it over the course of my life. A couple things that I know are that my bio parents were very image driven, and they were very fear driven. I think the whole reason they got into IBLP was because they're very fear-based people, and it had an answer for literally everything. And I think that appealed to them. I know that when my father found out about what my brother was doing to me, his reason for not getting help or getting me medical care or mental health care was because he didn't want to smear the family name. He was a very proud person. And I think in a lot of ways, ego drove the family and drove the decision making. And so while we talked a big game about, representing Christ and being humble and godly and obedient soldiers of Christ, I think what actually was in the driver's seat for my parents was image and ego, and had a really big impact on their decision making.
What are your earliest memories of your family? Is there a time you can remember when you were not afraid? Was this behavior on the part of your parents something that developed, something that got worse, or was it always there as far as you can remember?
I think it was always there. I think it worsened after they found out about my brother because it was such a threat to the image, the family image, their image. I don't have any memories free of fear. I have a really good memory. I remember my life before the sexual assault started, and the grooming for that started when I was still a toddler. I remember always being afraid of my mother and her volatility. My father wasn't as bad when I was a very young child, but that definitely changed after he found out about my brother. The way the cult viewed survivors of sexual violence was not at all accurate. There was a lot of victim blaming. There was a lot of placing the responsibility, particularly on the female survivors. So I think that colored how my parents viewed me. And I think it definitely, I had the family's deepest, darkest secret. And they were very image driven. So I think that really impacted how they viewed me, how they felt about me, how they related to me. I was no longer an innocent in their eyes. I was this risk factor after they found out about my brother. And I really think it colored how they treated me. They treated me very differently than my siblings after they found out what I'd lived through.
There are people out there today, Amanda, as I'm sure you know, who still ardently support IBLP. They claim there was nothing inherent in IBLP's teachings that would have led to abuse in the home. They say there were tens of thousands of families in this organization, and so of course, statistically speaking, there were bound to be problems in some families. And if IBLP involvement did somehow lead to abuse, it was only because the teachings were misinterpreted or misapplied. What do you say to those people?
Well, I say hold my beer, we gotta talk, because Fun fact about me, I've spent nearly 20 years now working with survivors of sexual assault. I'm currently getting my PhD in community health education, and my research area is sexual violence prevention, response, and recovery. So if they want to talk about it, they're going to need to come with receipts, because I have some. And what we know is that sexual assault is not about sex. It is, in fact, about power and control, the act of exerting dominance over another person. So when we look at organizations and environments like IBLP, what is one of the first things we notice? A hierarchical power structure that places men as God's mouthpiece. It gives them this incredible position and sense of privilege within the organization. So put a pin in that for a moment. We're going to step over into another bucket and talk about how predators behave. Predators position themselves in environments where they can manipulate victims. So they are going to look for environments that have hierarchies, that have power structures, that have ways for them to rise in their ability to access and manipulate their target demographic. And when you combine those two things, you have predators who are drawn to this sort of power structure. And then you have people who want power, control, and dominance being told that they are demigods. They are part of God's chain of command, chain of power. And they capitalize upon that. So I think that that is why you see such a high volume of sexual violence in cults. I'm a military veteran. I did a lot of sexual assault prevention and response work during my time on active duty. In my consulting career, I have worked with the military a lot around these issues. And I'm not saying the military is a cult. I'm saying that it's a hierarchical structure where you are given power and control. So that is going to attract predators. Now, not everyone in the military is a predator. Not everyone who joins a cult is a predator. A lot of them are, in fact, prey because they want answers. They want to be led. A lot of people join a cult because they want the answers. They want to be told what to do. They want to have the right way forward. So they make really good prey. So I think that the reason there was so much sexual violence in IBLP was because it attracted prey. It was an environment conducive to predators. And like my family, it was very image conscious. Most organizations are. That's why we have PR firms. Most organizations are going to do whatever they've got to do to protect their marketability, which generally means protecting their reputation.
So going all the way up to the top of IBLP, Bill Gothard and the leadership, do you think they realized what was going on here? Do you think they understood the consequences of IBLP's teachings and they simply chose to turn a blind eye? Or do you think something more nefarious was happening where they wanted it to be like this? This is how it was set up.
I think IBLP was designed as a front for Bill Gothard's pedophilia. And you can trace that back to 1961. Where did he start? He started with children. He started with a program for teenagers. And his interest in teenagers never wavered. No matter how old he got, his victims tended to be teenage girls, sometimes as young as 13 and 14 years old.
Just to clarify for listeners here, as we are editing in post-production, this is an allegation that has been made, but it has not been proven in a court of law.
So I think that Bill Gothard, I don't know if he even believed what he taught in terms of religion and faith and spirituality. And, people tell me in the course of my professional work, well, they'd never risk that. He would never risk this whole organization, his life's work. And I disagree with that. He absolutely would, because predators put themselves in those positions in order to risk it all to enact whatever their thing is. In Bill's case, it was teenage girls. So yeah, I think this whole thing was intentional. Everyone at the top knew.
How did IBLP say its followers should respond to sexual abuse or sexual assault?
Yeah, it was always supposed to be reconciliation, which, if you think about this through the larger lens of Bill Gothard's agenda, accessing teenage girls and harming them, it made a lot of sense for him to preach forgiveness and reconciliation because that protected him. So all of his teaching around sexual harm was either victim blaming or put the onus of responsibility on the victim to reconcile with their abuser. And I'm using the phrase here, victim, very intentionally. Generally, I like to say survivor, but when we're talking about the criminality of it, I intentionally use the word victim to remind myself and all of us that individuals who survive sexual assault are victims of heinous crimes. So, hence my usage of that. But yeah, the responsibility was on the victim to not get assaulted, to cry out according to Bill's definition of what that meant and how loudly you literally screamed for help while being assaulted. And if you didn't, then it was your fault and you wanted it. And then, in that case, you probably owed your abuser an apology.
And so, what was your parents' response when they found out what your brother was doing to you?
I was forced to apologize to my brother for, quote, bitterness, because I was upset at him for what he'd done to me. And rightfully so, but I was taken to him by my parents and forced to apologize to him for that. And in terms of how my parents handled the rape when they found out about it, they took the approach of having him say he was sorry to me. So I eventually disclosed to my parents with my very limited vocabulary around human anatomy and sexuality that something was happening with my brother. I did not have the word rape in my vocabulary at the time, but that is what it was. And so I described it to them the best I could. My brother had told me he would kill me, he would harm my other siblings if I ever spoke up about it. So it took me a long time to involve my parents. And when I did, I told my mother. She helped me tell my father the next day. And then sometime after that, they got me and my older brother up before the other children one day, sat us down at the kitchen table, read some Bible verses, told Andy he had unclean hands because of what he had done to me, and told him to say he was sorry, which he did. And I knew immediately that my life was in danger. And indeed, he strangled me after that. And I survived that encounter because of a fluke. He had me backed into a closet and strangled me, and luckily someone else in the family happened to walk by, so he dropped me. I passed out. He dropped me in the closet and shut the door, and I came to in the closet next to the vacuum. And I tried to tell my parents about it. My brother threw a screaming fit and called me a liar, and they decided to believe him. And of course, my brother went back to raping me.
This really stood out to me because they did believe you the first time when you reported this to them, right?
Yes.
And so it was hard for me to understand why they didn't continue to believe you as this was continuing, and with him attempting to kill you. What happened? Why did they suddenly start taking his side?
I think it was easier for them. It was easier to believe him and tell me to be quiet and stop being a liar and make it all go away. And my brother did other things to physically harm me in the aftermath of that left marks and bruises and cuts on my body. And they didn't really take those instances very seriously. They would tell me it was an accident or something along those lines.
And how old were you, Amanda, when this happened?
This went on from probably the age of 3 or 4 until I think it ended by the time I was 11.
Wow.
Yeah.
Even this whole thing about like Bill saying, it's the responsibility of the victim to cry out and then all these things, ridiculous. But you were 3 or 4 years old when this started.
Yes.
So what could you do?
That's a great question, Rob, that I didn't know to ask until I was much older. So I internalized a lot of it. I believed it was my fault, and I carried around the shame and guilt for about 15, 16 years before I was able to get help.
Another issue, here is it seems to me that the sin of sexual abuse, rape, was treated on the same level as any other sin. And so this matter of your brother, you waking up early and you sit down with your brother and he apologizes to you and that's it. Is it fair to say that what he did to you was considered to be like any other sin that you would ask
Yeah.
God for forgiveness
Yeah.
for?
And that was the family line for decades. And I think, well, I'm not in touch with them, but probably still is to this day, that Andy's fine. God healed him and made him better. And I just needed to forgive and forget and let the whole thing go.
Yeah, which is a lot like what we've heard coming from the whole Duggar family story.
Yes.
I also wanted to bring this other phrase into our discussion, which some of our listeners may not be familiar with, but purity culture, which I know that was a big part of IBLP. How did purity culture play a role in this abuse?
So purity culture emerged, I believe, in the 1990s, and it emphasizes sexual abstinence before marriage as like this marker of spiritual and moral worth. And it promotes like really strict gender roles, like traditional gender roles. It puts a lot of emphasis on female modesty and suppression of sexual thoughts, sexual desires. And there's a lot of emphasis placed on virginity and being a virgin until marriage. But some of the core beliefs are that women's bodies are evil. They're a temptation. They need to be covered because if you don't, you are tempting men, and that is your fault. And guys are told that their minds are evil and they need to control their minds. There's a lot of emphasis on like, you're bad, your body is bad, particularly if you're female. Your body is a trap. It's going to try to ensnare men. It is your fault if it does. It is your responsibility if you don't cover it all up. So part of purity culture is like a lot of virginity pledges, purity rings, courtship versus dating. And then we still see it in like abstinence only sex education. That's an offshoot of purity culture. So it's really about shame, in my opinion. It's about shaming people about their bodies, about their sexuality, and reframing particularly how girls grow up relating to their body and their sexuality. So in an environment where purity culture is the norm and you are taught from a young age as a girl that your body is a trap, your body is a temptation, it's really easy to apply that to sexual assault. And in fact, the cult did. In my cult church, our pastor would tell stories about how when he served on the board for IBLP, if a young lady was raped, then her parents would send in photos of the outfit she was wearing at the time of the assault. And then they would decide, this group of men would decide if she brought the rape upon herself because she was dressed in a way that tempted the man to assault her. I was obviously exposed to this growing up. I filtered everything through, oh my gosh, then maybe it was because I wore this or that and that tempted him too much. And I'm sure that's also how the adults thought of it and were trained to think of it. Like, I think that my parents thought I was this seductive little slut who lured my brother into raping me when I was a tiny child wearing pajamas the first time it ever happened. And it took me a really, really long time to offload that thinking and replace it with something healthy and true. But I think that purity culture just fed the narrative that assault was the female's responsibility to avoid and the female's fault if it happened because, well, the man couldn't help himself. The male, the boy, couldn't help himself. He was, his mind was too ensnared by the temptation of the female body.
So your brother apologizes to you. Are there any other consequences for this? Or was that really just it? Apologize and move on.
As far as I know, that was it the first time around. He, like I said, continued assaulting me, and he kind of upped his game, actually. He started assaulting me while I was asleep in the middle of the night, which was pretty gutsy because I shared a room with my other sisters. And one night I woke up with evidence of sexual assault, and I don't want to get graphic, but it was a situation where I needed medical help. And I tried to address it by myself. I couldn't. I was in a horrific amount of pain. I had to wake my parents up, and they had to perform a little medical procedure on me at home in the bathroom while I screamed and bled. So they saw the evidence. And I know that night my father went and screamed at my brother. He woke him up or got him out of bed and screamed at him. And then I was so lost in the sauce with that one. I was trying to make excuses for him and come up with ways that it wasn't his fault and alternative explanations for what had happened to my body. And I was terrified of my brother. This was after he'd strangled me as well. So I don't think that they had him do another apology after that. I think more time went by. And my father would sometimes check in with me like, hey, is Andy doing it again? And I was a very morally conscious child. I couldn't lie to save my life. I tried it twice. I had to turn myself in within 30 minutes. It just ripped me to shreds inside if I wasn't truthful. And this was something I lied about. I lied about a lot. He would say, is it still happening? I'd be like, nope, it's fine. It's good. And eventually I became so suicidal that I stopped caring what happened to me. And one of the times my father asked me if it was still happening, I just was like, yeah, probably very flat affect. I don't think there was a lot of emotion to it. I felt like I was signing my own death certificate saying that. And my parents did the same thing. They got me and my brother up before the other kids, sat us down at the exact same kitchen table, and told him to say he was sorry to me.
This part of your story is so surreal to me, Amanda. Your dad doesn't go to the police to report your brother for these ongoing horrific crimes against you, and he's relying on you, a little girl, to let him know if you are still being abused, which is crazy. So after your parents found out about this the first time, was there any extra measure of vigilance on their part? Were they at least careful about letting you be alone with him?
That's a funny question. Not that I remember, and in fact, they tried to put us together to restore our sibling relationship. He eventually got his driver's license. He's quite a bit older than I am. He's 7.5 years older than I am. So I was still quite young when he got his driver's license, and I was the first person he was allowed to take in the car with him. We went to the grocery store and got stuff because that was safe. But, Rick and Chris thought that things like that would restore our sibling relationship, and they didn't cut off his access to other children. In fact, when my little sister was born, she's 10 years younger than I am, I went to war with my parents because they let him just take her and go places with her and gave him unfettered access to her with no oversight, and actually encouraged that sibling bond and made a whole deal out of it where she was his special little sister. And that, oh my God, that wrecked me, because that's what he would call me when he was raping me, that I was his special little sister, and this is what good little sisters let their brothers do. So just even the language around it was horrific. And I couldn't believe that Rick and Chris gave him unfettered access to my younger siblings, particularly my little sister. And, they gave him unfettered access to everyone else's kids, too. They allowed him around my cousins, around the church kids. They allowed him to be a leader at the cult's children's seminar. I think, or Children's Institute, is that what? I
Yes,
think that's what it
CI.
was
That was
called.
another one of the
Yeah.
acronyms.
Yeah, so at the basic and advanced seminar, they needed childcare. So they had the Children's Institute where you would go, and there were usually teenagers. Often it was young people who worked at headquarters who would be like team leads for these groups of kids. And so you would have like your team, and you guys had a dedicated space, and then we do like a larger assembly where we all came together for story time and songs. Like, you had access to kids, and the leaders would like take them, when they needed to go to the bathroom and stuff like that. And they allowed Andy to function as one of those leaders after knowing what he had done to me and knowing that it was ongoing.
How we escaped.
Hi, Rob Drake here. Do you have a story of escape to share with us on the How We Escaped podcast? We'd love to hear your story and to consider airing it on our show. You can contact us right now by heading over to howweescaped.com and filling out our contact form. That's howweescaped.com. You can also reach out to us on Facebook, YouTube, or Instagram.
You're listening to the How We Escaped podcast with Rob Drake.
If IBLP had known what your brother was doing to you at home, do you think they would have cared? Do you think anybody cared?
Probably not, because they didn't stop Bill and his brothers when they found out that they were trafficking young girls between Oak Brook, the headquarters there, and the facility in the North Woods, where Bill's brother Steve was sent after his sexual relationship with a young lady. So, like, the board knew. Nobody in leadership cared. All they cared about was not getting caught. I don't know who knew. I have a feeling someone somewhere must have known something. When you got, like, my brother traveled with Bill. Andy traveled with Bill and ran the overhead. What was that called? Oh my
Projector?
gosh. Yeah. Yeah, he would run that for the seminars. So he had to like note take for Bill and get to know Bill's nuances with how he spoke so that he could react and do, like, because he would handwrite the notes as part of the overhead projection. So he went around the world with Bill. The Duggars were really well known. I'm thinking about the other famous cult families. I don't know how many of them also had stuff like this in their families, but like, these were people known to Bill, known well among the cult population. Someone must have seen something at some point.
That's a good segue into my next question for you, just to kind of stop for a second. And you really do a good job with this in your podcast as you're discussing what happened to you. But what are some telltale signs of specifically sexual abuse that people should watch out for or be aware of with children?
Yeah, that's a great question. So there are kind of a couple different buckets. There's like the social and relational, there's the mental, emotional, and then there's the physical, medical. So when we look at the physical, medical, it's going to be things like recurrent urinary tract infections. It's going to look like bruising on soft tissue, like thighs, arms. It could look like tears or bleeding around the genitals or the anus or the mouth. It can look like signs of STDs and STIs. It can also look like regression. So if we look more at the social, relational piece, you can have a child who developmentally regresses, like they start wetting the bed or sucking their thumb or clinging to a favorite toy or blanket when they've previously kind of moved away from that. How they're relating socially doesn't seem to match their biological age. They can isolate. You might see them withdraw or stop talking. You might see with the mental emotional piece of it, anxiety, depression. You might see a child start having intense mood swings. They might cry when they find out they have to be around a certain person or go to a specific place. So you might not see all of those things in one individual, but those are some well documented in research signs of childhood sexual assault. And I very much encourage you to take it seriously and get the proper professionals involved if you notice any of these things. That child is going to need medical care, mental health care, and it should be reported to law enforcement.
I asked you earlier about how people, from the outside saw your family. How do you think people saw you? Did you have friends growing up, and did you have some sort of normal social interactions? How did this horrific abuse affect you and the way that you related with others?
Yeah, I was not really allowed to have friends after Rick and Chris found out. I had a couple friends throughout my childhood, but it was very supervised. I think Rick and Chris were scared that I would tell someone, tell my friends, tell their parents. So I was kept on a pretty tight leash in terms of my ability to socialize. I had a lot of the manifestations of the trauma that I just listed. I did start wetting the bed. I started getting recurrent UTIs. I don't know if I regressed in other ways, but I know that I isolated a lot. I would hide. I would spend large chunks of the day hiding in my closet, just trying to stay away from my brother. Or I would go out to my swing set and I would swing as high as I could because I felt untouchable on my swing set. Or I would go into the woods next to our house and try to disappear for large chunks of the day. I'd climb a tree and I would just hide from my brother. I have memories of him coming out to look for me. I have memories, unfortunately, of him finding me and assaulting me outside. So I definitely isolated. I felt terror. I'm sure I was really depressed because I was very suicidal and I had high anxiety. And I think, the more I look back on that time in my life, I'm like, oh, I think a good psychologist probably would have diagnosed me with just about everything under the sun. I had probably, I'm not a therapist, so I'm hesitant to classify it. I'll just tell you what the behavior was. I tried to control every single thing that I could. I would make a schedule for my day down to the seconds. Like I would schedule seconds for opening a drawer and getting a piece of paper or a pencil out of it and shutting the drawer. And that was something that I could do that made me feel like I had a sense of control over my life. In reality, I did not, but it helped me. And I got really clingy with specific comfort toys. Like I had a certain stuffed animal. I had a Beanie Baby that was one of my comfort toys, and then I would attach to people I perceived as safe. They were usually relatives because I didn't have a large social circle. Like my grandma felt really safe. And so I would just try to be around her as much as I could. And my oldest sister, Andrea, felt safe. So I was attached to her, like literally attached to her. I would hold her hand. I guess this is another kind of awkward developmental thing. I would hold her hand in public until I was in my teens, just because I wanted safety. Like she made me feel safe. And unfortunately, she was not safe in the end. She's not in my life anymore. But that relationship was useful and helpful for a time. But I really think my grandma was probably one of the strongest protective factors in my life during the period where I was being assaulted. If I was with her, I knew nothing was going to happen to me.
Something else we haven't really talked about much here, but I know definitely played a role in all of this, is I believe you were homeschooled, correct?
Yeah, if you could call it that.
And it's ironic to me because the big argument for those who homeschool is that they are protecting their children from the evil public schools and all of the evil influences and all the bad things that happen. To hear this story about what was going on in your home, it really can give us a very different perspective on homeschooling. Tell us about, what was a typical day like for you being quote unquote homeschooled?
Yeah, it looked different at different ages and stages. When I was really, really young, Chris was more involved. I would say through third grade. Like, she taught me to read when I was 3, and then was actually, like, she would sit down with us. We had a schoolroom and there were desks, and we would have school hours, and we started with like the Pledge of Allegiance, and then we did the family pledge. I forget what it was. It might have been something from the cult. I honestly don't remember, but we said something else. And then, we'd have to sit there, and we had a Becca book, which is horrible. And then we had the cult curriculum, which is also horrible, but we would like systematically go through that, and we had like a pretty structured day. And then after about third grade, I'm not entirely sure what happened. Maybe it's because of my disclosure and Rick and Chris finding out about what Andy was doing to me. Maybe it was that, there were 8 kids by then. Chris just kind of disappeared from the picture, and I actually played a really big role in ensuring that I had something to do for school after that. I mean, I would just kind of be handed books and told to figure it out. The older I got, the less Chris was even involved in making sure that there were textbooks and workbooks by the time the school year started. So I would, go through, I think my science book textbook was like 30 years old or something. It was really outdated in high school. And I got online and figured out what you needed to graduate technically in the state of Wisconsin at that time. And I tried my best to find textbooks or get Chris to order me textbooks to meet those requirements. And then the first test I ever took was the ACT. And I got accepted to college when I was 16 or 17. And I, quote, graduated a year early because, there wasn't really an adult overseeing my education. I just went through the list I found online. And when I was done with all the textbooks, I was like, I guess I'm done and I can graduate and I'll take the ACT. And so, yeah, I had a little graduation ceremony that was also a voice recital because I studied opera from the time I was 13. And I was a class of 1 that graduated, and that was my formative education. It was me, really old textbooks, and a list that I got online trying to make sure I at least went through the textbooks you're supposed to go through to graduate high school.
Why do you think that IBLP was so big on homeschooling?
Control. It was a way to control because, IBLP had a bigger mission. I do think that Bill started everything because he needed a front for his pedophilia. And then I think he got looped in with Dobson and the Heritage Foundation, and they were on this mission to raise up what they called the Joshua generation to ultimately take over the government and turn America into a white supremacist Christian nationalist state. So you couldn't have your kids exposed to the real world if you wanted them to stay on target with this Joshua generation mission. So I think that we know that there's a lot of pedophilia among people, particularly men, who hold positions of power globally. So I think that joining ranks with these other hyper-conservative Christian organizations continued to give Bill legitimacy while also being partnered with organizations who would look the other way about what he was doing. And then he also had, this mission he could claim for ATI, that we were raising this generation that was so highly educated and they would go forth and become political leaders.
I found it really interesting hearing you talk about your adolescence, your teen years, with all of these things that were happening to you, all of this suffering that you were going through. It seemed to me that you continue, though, to become even more deeply embedded in this belief system. Did you actually believe any of it, or was it just a show that you were putting on for your parents and for your family?
Well, you're asking this question at a good time in my life to give you a good answer, because I've pondered this many, many times over the last couple decades. And the truth is that I knew Bill Gothard's teachings were bullshit from a really young age, like before the time I was 10. But my deepest secret is that I desperately want a family. And that meant I had to fit in to be part of mine. And I was already on the outside of mine because I was the person who carried the secret that could blow up the whole family and the family image, the perfect image. And so I conformed, and I really earnestly tried to believe it and to live it until my early 20s, or I guess it was about the time I turned 20. And I did that because the couple times I tried to step away, my family ostracized me, and I was told, like, you're a bad influence. You're not allowed to talk to your younger siblings. And they were my life. My sole mission growing up was to protect them and keep them safe from Andy, from Chris's violence, from, like, with 3 younger brothers in that environment. I knew what they were being shaped into. And I did not want that for them. I wanted them to grow up to be good men with a strong moral compass. And when I didn't play by the rules, I was not allowed to talk to them.
It sounds like it was really a love for your siblings, or most of your siblings, that kept you in.
Yeah, that initially, yep. And then when I went off to college and eventually my sophomore year started speaking up about what happened, the assault at the hands of my brother. When I told Rick and Chris I was getting therapy and I was in a support group, they then threatened my health insurance. And like a lot of survivors of childhood sexual assault, I have a lot of health issues. And I definitely had them severely at that time in my life. I didn't know I had complex PTSD. That wasn't diagnosed for several more years, and I didn't go through treatment for that until later. But I knew I needed help. I tried to get it. I tried to be transparent with my parents and actually confront them and tell them, like, we need to work through this. You guys did not handle it well, and I need us to talk about that, and I need us to be real and be honest and transparent about this moving forward. And I'm sick of carrying this deep, dark secret inside me. And I mean, I was told I was selfish and horrible for bringing it back up. I was told that if my father ended his own life because of the distress I caused by bringing it back up, that would be my fault. I was told that if I didn't go back to that support group I was in and apologize for saying negative things about my parents and my family, they would take away my health insurance. I was told if I didn't stop therapy, they would take away my health insurance. Like they really used my health insurance, because I was on their plan, to control me for a couple years. So between that and the older threat of losing access to my siblings, I really did try. Like, I was kind of in and out for several years in my late teens to very early 20s.
Well, let's talk about how you finally broke free. And I'm surprised that you went to college, because so many young women were married off quickly. So it almost seems to me like you were one of the lucky ones in a sense. I mean, how did it come about that you were allowed to go?
Yeah, so there was this window, at least in my family, that was an acceptable age to be married. And it was about, 20 to 24, if I'm recalling correctly. That was like the optimal marriage age. Before that was too soon. After that, like, oof, prospects are slim to none. And my oldest sister crossed that threshold. She passed the age of 24 without getting married. And Rick and Chris were like, oh my God, what if no one wants to marry her? We have to, like, she's going to have to live on her own eventually and pay bills. Now, you were supposed to be a stay-at-home daughter. You were supposed to stay with your parents until the ownership and authority over you was transferred to a husband on your wedding day. But I will say Rick and Chris did realize, like, Andrea needed to be able to make a living for herself. So they started looking at jobs and realized she needed a bachelor's degree to do any of the jobs that they felt were, not sinful for a woman. So she was allowed to go to Moody Bible Institute and pursue a degree in music, because music was kind of a catch-all for girls and young women in the cult, because you could teach it from home and still be under your husband's authority. If you got married, you could have students come to your home. Or if you weren't married, you could work, for a school or a church or something, but ministry was like the highest good. The best thing you could do was be in ministry. So Moody checked those boxes. It prepared you for ministry. She could get a music degree. It was really conservative Christian, not conservative enough because they allowed female students to wear pants, and it was nearby. It was only like an hour and a half away. And so that was considered a safe option. So that opened the door for all of us. When Andrea was allowed to go to college, then suddenly all of us were.
So what was it like for you to leave home and to live it's in downtown Chicago, right? That's where Moody is
Yeah.
located.
It was interesting. It wasn't like freedom because, like I said, I'm very morally and ethically driven. I did really internalize the umbrella of authority thing and Satan's fiery darts and like the way you have to gaslight yourself to be a good Christian within IBLP. So I was very obedient, even living across state lines as a legal adult. I had Rick and Chris still controlled me from there. Like I wasn't allowed to leave campus without their permission. I wasn't allowed to go on dates. I had to check in about pretty much every single decision I made. So it wasn't like I had this immense freedom, but I was at least exposed to other people my age who called me out on my shit and told me when I was being weird. And so I started learning like social cues and realizing that like people out in the real world have a different way of showing up and talking about things, and they say things differently and they listen to a lot more music than just hymns and classical music. And so and I had professors who challenged me because I would write papers, like especially in my philosophy course. Oh my gosh, I hated that professor. But looking back, I'm like, oh, he had a good point. Like I would write these stupid papers arguing that like rock music was evil and, presenting everything I knew growing up under Bill Gothard's teachings about why rock music was evil. And of course it was illogical and dumb. I didn't fully understand that at the time. So I would get my papers back with like all of this, red ink, like this is a logical fallacy and that doesn't make sense. And here's why that's wrong. And have you ever even like considered an opinion that is different than your own? And I was like, well, no, you're dumb. And I wrote it off initially. And then it all started having an impact on me. I think it was cumulative. My friends, my professors, just being out in the world, I was exposed to all these new ideas and ways of being and ways of thinking. And I learned to think critically in a way that I hadn't been instructed in before. And I learned how to kind of step back and analyze. And I think that I had those skills to a certain extent, but it had never been safe to use them to disagree with Bill or Rick. And I started disagreeing with Bill and Rick.
Well, let's talk about how you left IBLP. And was it a natural break, or was there sort of a turning point?
It definitely happened slowly over time to a certain extent. I think especially when I went away to college and started having other influences in my life, that support group that unfortunately I had to leave was really influential in helping me see that a lot of the teachings around, my culpability in the rape and things like that were incorrect. And then when you start deconstructing, like if one brick comes out, suddenly you're looking at all these bricks like, okay, how many of these need to come down too? So I started a slightly more systematic deconstruction after starting to get help for the sexual violence piece, because I realized like I was really wrong about this. I was taught really wrong stuff about this. What else has got to go? And I don't remember what it was, but there was a day I was sitting in the library at Moody working on an assignment, and I stumbled across something in my research that made me realize IBLP was a cult. And I didn't know what to do. I wanted to like jump or scream or run around in circles. It was like freeing and terrifying at the same time. And I remember looking up and seeing someone I kind of sort of knew because I had a bunch of classes with her, but we weren't technically friends. But I just like ran over to her and I was like, I know this doesn't make sense, but I just realized something that's like changing my whole life. And I just need someone to know. And she just looked up at me and was like, okay, Amanda. And, she went back to what she was doing. I went back to my existential crisis. And I think that my progression out of IBLP increased in speed after that. And definitely after I married my ex-husband, he didn't grow up in IBLP. He grew up in other, really conservative fundamentalist Christian culture. But we had a lot of good conversations around like, okay, how much of what we were raised with is just complete bullshit? And I started trying like different churches within Christianity still. I started reading different translations of the Bible. I started talking to people who held really different beliefs, but like still within Christianity at that time in my life. And it just kind of continued, and it continues to this day. I've continued taking the bricks out of the wall and examining them, and I'll be honest, most of them have landed in a heap over there somewhere, and I don't adhere to those things anymore. I don't allow that to be part of my identity or my belief structure anymore. But it was a very long process, like over 10-year process, to have the full realistic view of IBLP. It's really kind of agonizing to scrutinize yourself and your belief system that way. So I think that's part of the reason it can take a while to deconstruct. You have to have a very high tolerance for distress as you examine your beliefs and how they've impacted how you show up, how you talk to people, how you act.
I'm sure our listeners have noticed, and I noticed this almost right away when I started listening to your podcast, The Cult I Left Behind, the way that you refer to your parents by calling them by their first names. When did that kind of come along in this process? And, when did you make it clear to them that not only were you done with IBLP, but you were done with them, your parents, as well?
Yeah, I think that in my dreams, they all would have come on the journey with me. That's not at all what happened. I started referring to them by their first names, I think sometime after 2014. January of 2014 is when I reported my brother to law enforcement. He was arrested. We went through 4 years of criminal court. I talk about this a lot in the Cult I Left Behind podcast, but he basically got away with it. He got a slap on the wrist. And my family supported him through that entire process and cut me off, did not talk to me. They got a lawyer. Their lawyer told them not to talk to me. My younger siblings stopped talking to me. My older siblings, I haven't heard from them in ages. One of them since before I even reported, one of my older sisters. So I think it was, after I reported and saw the family just completely take my brother's side. I didn't expect that. I thought some of them would stand by me. I thought some of my extended family who was not part of the cult would stand by me. Nobody did. And I think that that's when I realized, as much as I want a family, this isn't my family. I was born into this group of people, but they're not my family. I tried to reconnect with my parents at one point in 2019, and they had not changed at all. So I told them that was it. Like, I was done. One of my younger brothers has circled back in a safe way and is in my life again. But that's it. Out of my whole family, I have one brother. I attempted to reconnect with one of my uncles and with my grandparents at one point. I was in touch with them for a couple years. Ultimately, that did not end up going very well, and I don't talk to them anymore. So I just have contact with one of my 3 younger brothers at this point in my life.
How has this disconnection from most of your family impacted your life?
It was horrible when it happened. I think that it's one of the most painful things I've ever gone through in my life, and I've been through some shit. It was worse than my divorce. It was life-altering in the most devastating way, especially my oldest sister, Andrea, because I adored her. Like I said, she was my safe person in the family. She was more of a mother to me than Chris ever was. Andrea's 10 years older than I am. My little sister, Abby, who I would have given my life to protect growing up. They all just believed, Rick and Chris, that I was exaggerating what happened and that Andy was okay. And it just broke me. It broke me for about 4 years. It took me 4+ years to get to a place where I wasn't devastated every day of my life. And it's been oh my gosh, I guess it's been like 14 years, 13 or 14 years since I talked to most of them. I think what I miss now is the idea of them. Part of the 4 years of agony was realizing that they weren't as wonderful as I thought they were. And we get a lot of messaging, especially in our culture, about like family is everything. Family is the most important thing. And we have a lot of quotes that aren't accurate and we cut them off too soon, but like blood is thicker than water. I don't believe those things. I think that we can take that a little too far. We can take our loyalty to family a little too far, like my family did in protecting my brother. And so I'm very mindful of that and I'm on the lookout for it. It's a really big red flag to me if people are willing to prioritize family over the safety of the vulnerable, for instance. And what I've learned about myself is I will always do the right thing no matter the personal cost. And that is a part of my DNA now. And when I figured out who I was and I looked at who my family is and the choices they make, I realized there was no value compatibility. So why would I want them in my life? They were not safe to me, and our values are so out of alignment that I could never have a meaningful, safe, healthy, true connection with them. So eventually I think I was able to let them go. I think it was like my mind let go first, and then eventually my heart followed. While I miss the idea of them, I am grateful I am not trying to balance their toxicity in my life now. I have really culled my inner circle of people, and I kind of forget what it's like to be treated poorly because the people close to me treat me really well. And it's been like that for a long time. So if I were to allow my family back into it, I would be allowing like a level of chaos and values misalignment that I don't tolerate from the people I allow close to me.
So, when you look back on your childhood, on your family, on your involvement in IBLP, how do you or can you make sense of all of it? I mean, have you found a way to process it? And what has this road to recovery been like for you?
Yeah, I think for me, naming things is really important. And that's, I don't know, that might just be very unique to me. But if it helps your listeners, I invite anyone to use the framework. I think it started by seeing Bill clearly first, because he's the most distal. Like he's the influence that while I met him, he creeped me out. I spent my life under his teachings growing up. He wasn't a daily physical presence in my life. So it was easier to deconstruct him. And everything that I described about power and control and dominance and setting yourself up as a predator to have access to people, like zooming out and seeing who Bill was and what his actual goals and priorities were and how IBLP facilitated that kind of helped me get my head around like IBLP was just a mess. It was a front. I don't know if Bill even believed any of the stuff he spouted theologically. It was, my opinion, all just a front and a cover for his pedophilia. So kind of deconstructing Bill and IBLP first was the gentlest entry point for me. And then I had to go to Rick and Chris, and I had to deconstruct their teachings and their approach. And I realized that like Chris's voice was a driving factor in my life. She was the voice I heard in my head before I made any decision, even if it was, which shirt to wear that day or which necklace to put on. I had Chris screaming in my head. And so rooting her out and replacing her with my own voice, realizing that my biological father isn't really a good person was one of the hardest days of my life, if not the hardest day of my life, because I idolized him growing up. And part of the deconstruction was realizing like what I was conditioned to do. We were all oriented to the man, to our father. Like he was this demigod because God spoke to him either directly or through Bill. And so there was like this reverence and awe around fathers in the cult, at least among the zealous families. And mine was definitely one of the zealous families. So getting a better view of Rick and Chris and their goals and their priorities, and how I definitely wasn't one of them. And safety and health, that wasn't their goal. Protecting their image was their goal. Like, kind of thinking through all of that, and then, just kind of moving more and more proximal, and ultimately looking at myself and my beliefs and how everything I just mentioned before, Bill and Rick and Chris and the whole environment, shaped me and how I showed up, and gently sorting through and untangling all of that. That was my process. And it was effective for me. It worked for me. It worked for my personality.
I suspect that there are probably thousands of people out there just like you. Where would you suggest that someone starts in terms of trying to deal with all of this? Again, I realize the processes are going to be different depending on the person, but where is a good starting point for someone who wants to get on this road of deconstructing their experience with IBLP?
I think you start by building the infrastructure first, because deconstruction is painful. And I never want to sugarcoat it. Like, it is so incredibly worth it to examine all of the inputs, like the formative inputs, and then to examine yourself and your values and how you show up. It is worth it. It hurts so much. And I think having the proper supports in place as you start that journey can really ease some of that pain. So I would say start by developing solid, safe friendships with people who push you outside your comfort zone a bit, because the deconstruction process is going to push you outside your comfort zone. And if you're already kind of inoculated to that through people who love you and aren't going to judge you and are going to show up for you and with you and question you and push back and give you grace, it's just going to be so much easier. I also think that having a therapist, if that's something that's accessible to you, having that space that is dedicated to your processing with a professional, especially if you can find someone who specializes in religious trauma or, sexual violence, if that's part of your story, or, cult ideology, whatever, however you want to approach that. Finding someone you can build a good therapeutic relationship with is important. And you might not find that good match on the first try. So you might have to plan for it to take a little while to find the right therapist with the right personality and the right therapeutic approach to support you. And then I think also getting yourself ready emotionally, making sure that you can give yourself grace and gentleness when it's needed, because you're going to uncover stuff where you're going to feel like shit about yourself because you had this absolutely terrible belief once upon a time, and you tried to evangelize someone and tell them that they were definitely going to hell because they're gay, or like something that you would just, it's so foreign to you now. You can't even like conceive of how you ever could have believed that. That's going to come up and you're going to feel like shit about yourself. So having the ability to give yourself some grace, to forgive yourself, even just sometimes you're going to need a slight sense of humor about yourself and your fuck ups. There is sometimes no other way to get through it. So I think having that infrastructure in place as you start a deconstruction journey, oh my gosh, I wish I had that. I wish I could, if I could do a redo of the last 20 years of my life, it would be the infrastructure piece.
And I think that everything you just said here is on full display in your podcast. This is such a unique podcast that you have. I've been continually amazed by your ability and your willingness, of course, to share about your story so openly. And I just wonder, how much has this podcast, The Cult I Left Behind, been part of your journey here, your journey to recovery?
I think it played a much bigger role than I realized when we started the show. We started it, my husband and I started it as a hobby, as newlyweds. He knew I grew up in a cult, and we were like, let's do a show where I tell you my stories and you don't know what I'm going to say, and you just like live react, and no one will listen to it, but hey, we'll have a couple hobby. And it turned into so much more than that. And we gained this global community of the loveliest people on the planet, I'm convinced. And I think that the questions they asked over the course of 100 episodes pushed me to consider things that hadn't occurred to me, pushed me to look at things from different angles. I think that the grace and love and support with which that listener base received me and my stories gave me a level of confidence that I could continue to be so open and authentic, and that it would be received well by safe and healthy people. And I think that that was a healing experience in and of itself. Like when I talked to my family about my experiences growing up, I was met with judgment and disbelief and basically told, like, you're just being silly and dramatic. Go sit in a corner and shut up. And when that's what you're used to, and then this global community of people reaches out through the internet to wrap their arms around you, that is healing in and of itself. That is a healing experience. And I'm so grateful for past me who was brave enough to open her mouth and share these things, because I would have missed out on that. I never would have had that experience of being loved and accepted and seen and heard and witnessed. And I really think that that's the thing. I think that's part of why I say you need people on your healing journey, because being witnessed is such a healing thing. The beautiful thing about the cult I left behind was that our listeners witnessed me and us, and they would send messages and give us the opportunity to witness them. And I hope that that's been as healing for them as it was for me and it was for my husband.
As we wrap up here, tell us what you're up to these days and how our listeners can continue to connect with your work.
Absolutely. So we recently stopped releasing regular episodes of The Cult I Left Behind, but it is still available anywhere you stream podcasts. There are 100 episodes to go binge if you would like more IBLP cult stories or want to hear more about me. And then in the last couple of weeks, I launched a spin-off show called The Healing Life. I host that one alone, but I have guest interviews scheduled, and that show is about healing being a lifelong journey, and how we heal and how we continue to show up as life changes and new things come up, and we realize, like, oh, I thought I was healed and now this layer shows up. What do I do now? What do I do next? I think of it like a companion to healing. I hope that that's the community that continues to show up around that show. So you can find that one on Spotify, Apple, YouTube. It lives on Substack as well. I decided not to put that show on Meta, but the Cult I Left Behind, we have Instagram and Facebook if you want to connect there. And I'm planning to get The Healing Life on more platforms. I also have a consulting firm called First Point Strategies, where I offer educational speaking and workshops, conferences, things like that. So I love that work and will continue to do it. I'm getting my PhD now, but I still take some clients as my schedule can allow, and I intend to get into the consulting even more upon graduation in a few years. So I love what I do. I love having these conversations. I love educating folks and just walking through life with people. I think that, again, that community healing happens in community. So I try to make sure that I am always involved in a healing community. And if I don't have one, I build one. So that's kind of what The Healing Life is for me.
Well, Amanda, my last question brings us full circle, I suppose, back to the top of the show. You told us how much you loved your Cabbage Patch Kids and your My Little Ponies, and you told us how one evening you were made to throw them into a burn barrel because IBLP taught that they were demonic. So I have to ask, did you ever get to play with those toys again? Do you have any of them now?
You know, my husband and my mother-in-law got me some 2 Christmases ago. They did not coordinate that. My mother-in-law is lovely. She listens to the show, and she heard the whole saga. So she came to Christmas prepared with My Little Ponies. And then my husband got me My Little Ponies and a Cabbage Patch doll. So I have them now, finally. I cried so much that Christmas. It was a very, like, kind of full circle healing moment that I didn't know I needed, but turns out I really needed it.
Well, Amanda, I want to thank you so much for joining us on the How We Escape podcast and for being so open about your story. I feel like your willingness to tell it like it happened is so important for shining a light in the darkness. And I know that many people are and will continue to be inspired by you. So thank you.
Thank you so much for having me. It was a wonderful experience coming on the show and talking with you today.
Please go and listen to Amanda and Kyle's podcast. It's called The Cult I Left Behind, and it's available on Spotify, Apple, and wherever else you like to listen to podcasts. Their conversations are compelling, they are raw, and they are real. Sometimes I found myself laughing, sometimes I found myself on the verge of tears, but it is an important listen. And as Amanda mentioned, she has a new podcast called The Healing Life. Wherever you are listening, please don't forget to subscribe to our podcast, How We Escaped. Our next story is coming soon, and you will not want to miss it. I want to end our show today with a quote from the poet Robert Frost. He wrote, "In 3 words, I can sum up everything I've learned about life. It goes on." Until we meet again, I'm Rob Drake. Yellaby.
Have a story to share with us? Visit howweescape.com to get in touch.
How We Escaped.